There were a lot of things about it that caught my attention because I had read this book 1 second after. In the book, there were 3 EMPs that were detonated over the United States. The one centrally located over the continental U.S. was detonated over the Midwest in the Kansas and Nebraska region. And I had seen the original report that was presented to the House of Representatives back, I believe, in 1997, map of where the most likely and most devastating locations for EMP detonation would be over the United States. We're not claiming that this Chinese spy balloon was an EMP platform, but its path, its altitude was certainly interesting. We are asking some legitimate questions, I think. Why a balloon? Why that particular altitude? Why that particular path? The Congressional Commission report explicitly warned about not only that very delivery mechanism, the balloon, but also that very path as well.
The impact of EMP is asymmetric in relation to potential protagonists who are not as dependent on modern electronics. More and more societies around the world are getting more and more dependent on AI, or artificial intelligence, which of course is 100% reliant on electronics. AI is slowly creeping into running our critical infrastructure. It's already been creeping into helping the U.S. military make tactical targeting decisions. So, if our systems are relying on AI, never mind just basic electronics, it just compounds how impactful having an EMP attack and wiping that out would suddenly have devastating effects. And the average citizen is also becoming more and more reliant on AI for more and more things. So there's a concern, of course, that AI is going to and already is starting to replace a lot of jobs. So imagine if several sub-industries are replaced by AI in the next, say, 5 years or so, and now you have a whole pool of people who don't even do a particular job anymore because AI has been doing it for several years, which means you don't have a college pipeline or a training pipeline to train people for that job anymore. And now that's wiped out, and now you have whole sectors of industries that don't even have human knowledge on how to do that role anymore.
Yeah.
So it's just, as time goes on, the threat gets worse and worse and worse.
The one thing that stood out to me the most was his 12-year-old daughter who was dependent on insulin that became impossible to resupply, and the limited supply that you did have had to be refrigerated, and without electricity, refrigerators are not working. And so the clock immediately starts ticking on these 40 million Americans that are insulin dependent. As a father, putting myself in Matherson's position, I can't fathom how that would be. And the great lengths to which Matherson went in the story to preserve the little bit of insulin that they had, and then to try to get more. It goes to that moral dilemma that you were talking about before. You have to start making some hard decisions, doing things that in any other circumstances you wouldn't even contemplate doing. But now the life of your child is on the line. It's straight up survival. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning, your phone doesn't turn on, your car won't start, the lights don't come on, and it's not just you. It's not a storm. It's not a cyber outage. There's no warning, no visible destruction. Catalyst for the collapse of civilization didn't come with a bang. It happened quietly, over 100,000 feet above your head in the night sky while you were sleeping. Civilization as you knew it yesterday is gone, even though most haven't realized it yet. Its collapse has been set in motion. It started 1 second after the event itself. Most don't realize the gravity of the situation yet, but they will, and soon. As society begins to unravel, we begin to see what a tenuous hold we had on civilization all along. We begin to see the realities of what Rudyard Kipling described. A stone's throw out on either hand from that well-ordered road we tread, and all the world is wild and strange. Churl and Gal and Gin and Sprite shall bear us company tonight, for we have reached the oldest land wherein the powers of darkness range. Could very well be the beginning of the end. The doomsday clock is ticking, methodically, 1 second at a time. Today, we're going to talk about why that scenario that I just described is not science fiction, and why Congress has been warning about it for more than 20 years. Welcome back to Fire for Effect. I'm Marcus Moyer. I'm here today with Jim McBride, and this is episode 35 of Fire for Effect, recording on March 18th. How you doing, Jim?
Good, Marcus. This is going to be eye-opening for us as well, hopefully as for our audience, to help us all kind of be aware that this is a real threat that hopefully never happens, but is easier to happen than people might think. So looking forward to diving into this in this 3-part series.
As we do almost every week, we tend to jump into topics that are well above our pay grade and beyond our expertise, but we have a right to do that. And we're just interested people who like to read and study. So we're going to learn about this together today and over the next couple of weeks. All of these documents that we're going to study on this, or that we're going to go through on this topic, they're in the public domain. A lot of them have some redactions in it, but they're not classified documents. Anybody can go read these things. And I would encourage everybody to do that. Go read these. And so just ordinary people, Jim and I, here talking to an audience of ordinary people. And we're gonna study this together and see what we can learn just from the documents that are publicly accessible on this topic. As Jim said, this is the first episode in a 3-part series on the threat of an electromagnetic pulse, or an EMP. What it is, what it would do to the United States if one were to occur here, and why, despite decades of warnings, very little, it seems, has been done to protect us from this threat that Congress has known about for well over 20 years. If you enjoy Fire for Effect, if you get anything out of all of these conversations at all, like, share, subscribe. It does help the algorithm. And you can find us on YouTube, Rumble, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Substack. You can listen to Fire for Effect on any of those platforms, and you can view the video content on those that offer that option. So like YouTube and Rumble, Spotify, and Substack. And that's always the best option if you want the full experience. We almost always include a lot of visual and video content intended to make the experience and the discussion even better. So like and share and subscribe. Leave us a comment or an idea for a future episode. Several viewers and listeners have taken us up on that offer in the past, and some of our recent episodes have actually been inspired by those suggestions that we've received. And we have several more episodes coming up in the future based on viewer suggestions as well. So, what is an EMP? What is an electromagnetic pulse, and what happens in such an event? There's an online creator. I want to give credit to this gentleman. He did a fantastic job talking about this topic. He goes by the handle The Reliable Prepper, and he provided a great overview of electromagnetic pulses, the different types, and kind of the initial fallout after an EMP event. So that's a perfect starting place for today's discussion. So let's watch what the reliable prepper had to say.
An electromagnetic pulse is basically a massive surge of energy that induces destructive electrical currents in anything with wires, circuits, or transformers, which in today's world is pretty much everything we depend on. There are three main types of EMPs we need to worry about, and each one comes with its own specific dangers. First, there's the high-altitude nuclear burst, or HEMP, which would be detonated anywhere from 25 to 400 miles above the United States. The terrifying part about this scenario is that a single well-placed weapon could blanket most of the continental U.S. with these damaging electromagnetic fields. The 2004 Congressional EMP Commission didn't pull any punches when they warned that a successful EMP strike could potentially kill the majority of Americans within a year, not from the explosion itself, but from the cascading infrastructure failures that would follow when everything electronic stops working at once. The second threat vector is a coronal mass ejection, or CME, which is basically a massive eruption of plasma from the sun. History has already shown us what these can do. Back in 1859, the Carrington event hit Earth with such force that telegraph lines sparked and operators could send messages with their batteries completely disconnected, and that was with 19th century technology. Our modern electrical grid, loaded with billions of sensitive transistors and thousands of miles of transmission lines, is exponentially more vulnerable to this kind of solar tantrum. The third possibility is localized non-nuclear EMP devices, sometimes called E-bombs. Military forces already use these to disable enemy electronics, and it's not hard to imagine terrorist groups deploying smaller versions against data centers or regional grid nodes. While these wouldn't take down the entire country at once, they could still create devastating regional blackouts that cascade into wider systems failures. Each of these threats varies in intensity, geographic coverage, and warning time, but they all share one brutal characteristic: speed. Within nanoseconds, transformers would fry. Within seconds, control centers would go dark. And within minutes, everything built on those systems would collapse in sequence. This isn't a slow-moving hurricane you can outrun or a pandemic with an incubation period. When an EMP hits, you're already in the middle of the disaster before you even know what happened.
So great job by the reliable prepper on that clip. And what he described in that short video, which is just the beginning of a much longer video. So I encourage you to go to the reliable prepper, his podcast, and watch that whole thing. It's really, really good. But that same scenario was the focus and the feature of a book that was written by William Forstchen entitled 1 Second After. And that's where we're going to start today. We're going to start with William Forstchen's novel, and then we're going to peel back that fiction and look at the official government reports that inspired that story that he wrote. Because the uncomfortable truth is that Mr. Forstchen's book does not exaggerate the danger of an EMP. If anything, it simplifies it and doesn't even do it full justice. But it's a fantastic book. If you haven't read it, highly encourage you to do so. I read it a number of years ago. I will warn you, though, that as soon as you read it, a couple of things are going to happen. You're going to want to go plant your own garden. If you don't already own a gun, you're going to want to go buy one. If you already own guns, you're probably going to want to go get more and then stockpile ammunition. And then probably buy one of these Patriot generators, these solar power generators that are supposedly hardened against EMPs. So I don't have that yet, but I'm looking at one. So I'll kind of provide a quick introduction to Mr. Forstchen's book 1 Second After, and then I'll turn it over to you and you can kind of walk us through the story. But 1 Second After, again, by William R. Forstchen. It's a novel that explores the societal consequences of a large-scale electromagnetic pulse attack on the United States. It's set in the small town of Black Mountain, North Carolina, and the story follows John Matheson, a former U.S. Army officer and college professor, as he and his community struggle to survive after modern technology abruptly fails. The novel opens with a sudden and unexplained event. Electronic devices across the country stop working simultaneously. Cars stall, phones die, power grid collapses. There's no explosion, no visible destruction, only silence. It's later understood that a nuclear weapon was detonated at a high altitude over the United States, generating an EMP that disabled electronic systems across much of the nation. So that's the opening. That's the setting for this story. So over to you, Jim.
Thanks, Marcus. Yeah, the book is structured in chapters that track the progression of days, weeks, and months after the event. So it's just a chronological telling, fictional telling of the life of this gentleman and his family and his community after that EMP. So here's a concise chapter by chapter summary grouped where appropriate for brevity, focusing on key events without spoilers or beyond the major plot beats. So the early chapters, days 1 and 2, on an ordinary spring afternoon, John Matherson prepares for his diabetic daughter Jennifer's 12th birthday. Suddenly at around 4:50 p.m., phones, cars, electricity, and all electronics fail simultaneously. Initial confusion gives way to realization that this is no ordinary blackout. It's an EMP event. John, drawing on his military experience, begins assessing the situation while his family and neighbors panic. Basic services collapse instantly. Hence 1 second after. In the first week, the town grapples with immediate consequences: no refrigeration, no transportation, no communication. John helps organize a community, confirms the EMP nature through old radios and knowledge of history and military threats. Food shortages loom as modern supply chains vanish. Jennifer's insulin becomes a crucial concern. Looting and fear spread. John aids in basic security and resource assessment. Weeks 1 to 4, society begins to fracture already. Starvation sets in as stored food runs out. Disease spreads without modern medicine or sanitation. John emerges as a leader, coordinating with local officials, college staff, and residents to ration supplies, form patrols, and defend against refugees and bandits. Moral dilemmas arise over scarce resources, including tough decisions about who gets limited insulin and food. Once 1 to 3, the death toll skyrockets. Estimates suggest 90% of the U.S. population will perish from starvation, disease, violence, and exposure. 90%. Black Mountain, North Carolina, forms as a fragile community government. John leads efforts to plant crops, hunt, and fortify defenses. Refugees flood in, straining resources and leading to conflicts. Old social orders break down, violence and desperation increase. Months 4 to 6, winter approaches, exacerbating hardships. The town faces external threats from organized raiders and internal tensions over leadership and rationing. John confronts personal losses and the psychological toll. Efforts shift to long-term survival, bartering, makeshift medicine, and rebuilding basic skills from pre-industrial times. Months 7 to 12, so we're still within a year of the event. The community stabilizes somewhat, but remains precarious. John takes a central role in town defense and governance. Encounters with remnants of federal authority reveal the broader national catastrophe. Multiple high-altitude nuclear detonations over the U.S., Europe, and Asia. The narrative builds to a grim assessment of humanity's fragility. And something to point out there is that, again, it's a fictional book, but we're into almost a year of this event happening, and because communication is completely wiped out, almost all forms of communication, the community didn't even know that this had happened around the world in other places. Final chapters, 1 year later, on the anniversary, the town reflects on massive losses. U.S. military remnants arrived to aid recovery, confirming the EMP was from offshore launched missiles, attackers unknown. And John realizes the old America is gone forever, with survivors facing a long, brutal road ahead. And a key part of the story is his daughter being a diabetic. And I think that there's almost 40 million Americans that have diabetes that are insulin dependent. So that right there really highlights, which has to be, insulin has to be refrigerated. So It's a key component that he put in the story that makes a lot of sense because it's so many Americans are dependent on refrigerated insulin to survive. So that's a brief summary of the book.
Yeah, the other thing that I recall, that obviously that was the one thing that stood out to me the most, was his 12-year-old daughter who was dependent on insulin that became impossible to resupply, and the limited supply that you did have had to be refrigerated, and without electricity, refrigerators are not working. And so the clock immediately starts ticking on these 40 million Americans that are insulin dependent. And I can only, as a father putting myself in Matherson's position, I cannot even, I can't fathom how that would be. Um, and the great lengths to which Matherson went in the story to preserve the little bit of insulin that they had, and then to try to get more. It goes to that moral dilemma that you were talking about before. You have to start making some hard decisions, doing things that in any other circumstances you wouldn't even contemplate doing. But now the life of your child is on the line. It's straight up survival, and those survival instincts kick in, and everybody is having the same instinct. Hence the unraveling. So that was the thing
Yeah.
that stood out to me the most that I remember. The other one was the fact that even though, in many cases it's still possible to produce a lot of food in the middle of the country, in the breadbasket of the country, since all transportation relies in some form on electricity as well, whether it's the trucks or the airplanes or the trains. Even though you can produce food in the middle of the country, you can't transport it to the coasts. And so you may have a bunch of food stocks, food supplies in the middle of the country, but it does no good to anybody else. And the coasts are starving. We'll get into a little bit more of that when we start stepping through the congressional report. But the point is here is that while 1 second after is a work of fiction, Fortune stated explicitly in the foreword of his book that the entire story was inspired by a real congressional study on EMP threats. The novel's impact, actually, for me, comes from its plausible portrayal of how quickly modern life just unravels and falls apart, and how unprepared society may be and likely is for a prolonged nationwide loss of electricity. As one commentator put it, in 1 second, we're instantly transported back into the 1800s. And we're not prepared as a society to survive in that environment. We've lost the skills. We don't remember how to do the things that our forefathers did. And for all of those reasons, the death toll is expected to be 90+% of the American population within a year, as you just laid out. So what matters here, and what we want to talk about today, is why Fortune wrote this book. As I just said in the foreword, he tells us plainly that the story is based on a 2004 Congressional Commission report. Not speculation, not a think tank paper, but a formal assessment ordered by Congress. And as we've said in the promotional videos leading up to this episode, the report exists. It's unclassified. Portions of it are redacted, but it's unclassified and anybody can go read it. But almost no one has. So in 2004, Congress released the report of the commission to assess the threat to the United States from the electromagnetic pulse attack. And I think it probably got very, very little attention because its release coincided, if I recall, almost concurrently with the 9/11 Commission report, which of course got a lot more attention. And then this just went unnoticed. But the commission itself wasn't alarmist. If you go read it, it's a commission made up of physicists, engineers, and senior defense experts. Very smart, very deliberate, very logical, rational people. And so the intent of the report, as I just said, it wasn't a group of alarmists and conspiracy theorists that got together and wrote this thing. Congress ordered it, and this group of very smart professionals put it together. And the key findings were laid out very plainly. And there's been follow-on reports since then, and the one we'll focus on today is a more recent one from 2017, and looking at their conclusions. But here's what they concluded: that one nuclear weapon detonated at a high altitude, could affect most, if not all, of the continental United States at the same time. And the devastation comes not from the blast, not from radiation, but by overwhelming the electronics that control our entire infrastructure now. The United States is so dependent on the electrical grid. If and when that grid goes down, the initial and cascading effects are absolutely devastating. The report emphasized something very critical: the indirect effects of what happens when electronic controls fail are more damaging than the initial pulse itself. Power goes down, then telecommunications, then fuel, then water, then food. We already talked about challenges to medication and logistics. Each of these systems depends on the other to recover, and that cascading effect, it snowballs. So the 2017 Chairman's Report is full of very interesting details, analysis, and warning. And we'll walk through some of that together here. And we'll provide the links and encourage, as we always do, don't take anything we say on this show at face value. Don't take our word for it. We always encourage the audience to go read these things for themselves and come to their own conclusions. We try to present it in the most honest and objective way possible, citing from the original sources, but we always encourage people to go to the source themselves. So this 2017 report was prepared by Dr. William R. Graham, chairman of the Commission to Assess the Threat to the United States from Electromagnetic Pulse Attack. So you get just a few pages into this report, page 5, and it says, the report says that the single most important action that must be taken immediately to advance the national strength and survivability is to establish an executive agent with the authority, accountability, and resources to manage the U.S. national infrastructure protection and defense against the existential EMP threat. So they recognize that as a need. And here in a couple of weeks, well, actually next week and the following week, we're going to have a chance to talk to people who work with the electrical grid, as well as people who lobby on Capitol Hill for what this commission has said is necessary. And we're going to explore over the next couple of weeks whether or not these things are actually happening. The report says that extensively tested, performance-proven technologies for EMP hardening have been developed and implemented by the Department of Defense to protect critical military systems for over 50 years. So we've known about this threat, and according to this report, have been doing things behind the scenes for 50 years. The report says that these technologies can be affordably adapted to protect electric grids and other critical infrastructures at a remarkably low cost relative to that of an EMP catastrophe. And as we'll see as we step through this, the costs of the catastrophe itself are astronomical, not in terms of just damage to the infrastructure, the cost of repairs, if repairs are even possible, but the toll, the human toll, is through the roof. The report says a plausible long-term nationwide blackout of the electric power grid and grid-dependent critical infrastructures like communications, public health, transportation, food, and water supply could disable most of our critical supply chains, leaving the U.S. in its condition prior to the advent of electric power in the 19th century, when the national population was less than 60 million. But today, without many of the past skills and assets necessary for our population to survive in those conditions, the results would be the death of a large fraction of the American people through the effects of starvation, disease, and societal collapse. And as we said a little bit ago, that estimate is as high as 90% in some cases. The United States, the report continues, as the most technologically advanced nation in the world, is also the society most dependent upon electricity and electronics for survival and well-being. So there's a couple of ways that this can come about. The Reliable Prepper pointed a couple of these out in that initial video that we showed. The first is solar superstorm. So you don't even need a bad actor in this scenario for this type of an event to happen. It doesn't have to be a nuclear device that causes it. But whether there's malintent and a nuclear device involved or not, the end result is the same, an electrical grid that is demolished and all of the cascading effects that follow. So solar superstorms is a natural way that something like this can happen. And it's happened in the past, and it's been narrowly averted in more recent years. But in 1859, an event called the Carrington event, which the Reliable Prepper mentioned briefly in his video, generated a natural electromagnetic pulse. Didn't have nearly the effects in 1859 that it would in 2026, because obviously we were not nearly as reliant on electricity in 1859. But the recurrence of another Carrington-type event, NASA believes, is inevitable. NASA reports that the Earth was nearly impacted by a solar superstorm on July 23, 2012. And NASA estimates that the likelihood of such an event is about 12% per decade. So low likelihood, but a very low risk, but high impact if it ever did happen. Virtually, so NASA says that the estimate is 12% per decade, virtually guaranteeing Earth will be impacted by a solar superstorm within the lifetimes of our grandchildren, and perhaps ourselves as well. This is right out of the Commission's report. So that's one way it can happen. The other way, which was the focus of Fortune's book, is a nuclear EMP attack. Conducted with only a single nuclear weapon, detonated at a high altitude, usually I think 30 kilometers is what they say, which is about 100,000 feet. Delivered either by satellite, a wide variety of long and short-range missiles, a jet, and this one's interesting, even a high-altitude balloon. That'll be an important data point later. We're going to talk about that. The report goes on to say that Russia and China now have the capability to conduct a nuclear EMP attack against the U.S., and if not already at hand, North Korea will soon have that capability as well. And again, this was 2017 that they wrote this. All have practiced or described contingency plans to do so. So the Commission is saying that not only do our adversaries have this capability, they've actually advertised that they have plans to carry it out. Terrorists or other less sophisticated actors also might mount a nuclear EMP attack if they have access to a suitable nuclear explosive. The gentleman we're going to talk to in a couple of weeks is part of a group who's written about this. They're involved with developing some of this technology that we've alluded to, and these less sophisticated actors that the Commission is talking about here. There is a small device called a Marx generator. We won't get into what that is today, but we'll talk about it in a couple of weeks. Not expensive or difficult to make. Probably these less sophisticated actors wouldn't be able to deploy it at an altitude, and it's not the size that would be necessary to have the effect that we're talking about here in this Commission, but it could definitely devastate a smaller region. So we've got these solar superstorms that can cause this, a nuclear EMP attack, sabotage. Again, the mechanism for making this happen is less important than the actual end results, whether it happens naturally or by a nuclear EMP attack, or if it's just the result of sabotage, which is the next item addressed in the report. Sabotage of the national grid by damaging extra high voltage transformers using rifles, explosives, or non-nuclear EMP weapons could produce protracted and widespread blackouts by attacking less than a dozen major grid substations, according to the public statements of a past chairman of the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. At least one substantive rehearsal of such an attack may have already taken place. The sophisticated, damaging attack of the Metcalf Electric Substation in the San Francisco Bay Area. So the vulnerability of these substations and the fact that only a small number of them would need to be targeted in order to have much the same effect as what Fortune describes in his book is a real possibility in the mind of this commission. And next week, we'll be talking to an individual who works in the utility industry. And it'll be very interesting to get his perspective, especially on this. Combined cyber warfare is another way this can be brought about. Foreign adversaries, excuse me. Foreign adversaries may also consider nuclear EMP attack as the ultimate cyber denial of service weapon, one which can gravely damage the U.S. by striking at its technological Achilles heel without having to engage the U.S. military. This asymmetric warfare, rendering obsolete many, if not all, of the traditional instruments of military power. And so the chairman of the commission then states that while I highly commend President Trump's new executive order strengthening the cybersecurity of federal networks and critical infrastructure signed on May 11, 2017, I strongly recommend that implementation of cybersecurity for the electric grid and other critical infrastructures include EMP protection, since all-out cyber warfare as planned by Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran includes nuclear EMP attack. I'll stop there, Jim. What are your thoughts so far?
Well, I think one reason that so far this has been mostly ignored by Congress, thankfully not ignored by President Trump, and again, that executive order that was referenced, I think was in 2019, just during Trump's first administration. But this seems like such a overwhelming catastrophic threat, and it is, that it seems like it's almost human nature that's why it's been ignored because it seems like it's such a dangerous, overwhelming, comprehensive threat that Congress doesn't have the bandwidth to focus on it. It reminds me of the national debt, for example, of how overwhelmingly huge and potentially catastrophic that is in the long term. And Congress just keeps kicking the can down the road. And here we are with this threat that, as that report you just read illustrates, can be executed relatively easily by an enemy threat. And by the way, hopefully to a lesser extent by natural causes from the sun. Yet Congress Congress has been so far unwilling to really do much about it. But as that report also illustrates, the U.S. military has been aware of this threat for decades and has been made things to protect and strengthen military critical resources from EMP threats. And they're relatively low cost, again, compared to the cost of actually experiencing an EMP without those precautions in place. And I hate to say this, but I think, the political polarization that's gotten worse and worse over the last 10 years or so makes addressing things like this even harder, because Congress can't seem to agree on the basic things, never mind something this comprehensive. So those are my initial thoughts, that it's something that can be mitigated if we work together, if Congress works together. And we'll find out over the next couple weeks, couple episodes, if President Trump's 2019 executive order has been followed up on by anybody, including the Trump second administration. First of all, was it followed up on during Biden's administration, and hasn't been followed up on in Trump's second administration? We would hope so, since he's the one that wrote that executive order in his first administration. But as far as being just a kind of an average citizen, retired Marine, other than this book coming out and, you haven't read it and bringing it to my attention, I would not have even heard. And just my own knowledge, like I'm aware of EMP threats and things like that, just because I have just a natural interest myself to look at these kind of things. But the average citizen, I'm sure, has no idea about this threat. And that says something right there. So we're definitely not prepared as a society, and I think we need to start getting prepared. And I think this is hopefully we'll raise some awareness to get that started.
Yeah. Friend of mine that pointed me to this book is the gentleman that we're going to talk about or talk with in a couple of weeks, the lobbyist on Capitol Hill. That this is one of the things that is very, very high on his list of priorities for the things that he talks about. And he gave me that book. So I'm really looking forward to talking to him. And I'm looking forward to next week's guest as well, because the practical application of this report and its recommendations, as well as President Trump's executive order, is what does that look like on the actual grid? Like, how do you harden our actual infrastructure, these critical infrastructures? And the gentleman we'll talk to next week, he works inside the grid. He's an electrician. He works for the utilities. And I'm really interested in his perspective on what would need to happen. One, are we as vulnerable as this report makes us out to be? Has any progress been made over the last 22 years? If so, what have we done? And what still needs to be done? And what does that look like in terms of the work that needs to be done, like the actual work, and the cost? I know the report says that the cost of hardening our grid is relatively low compared to the cost of an event that occurs and we're not prepared for it. So that goes without saying. Regardless of how expensive it is to fix this, it's less expensive than that. But what is the actual cost? Because money does matter. Whatever it is, I think we have to invest it. But what is the cost? You have to count the cost. Where does the money come from? So now I'm interested in all of those things, and I don't have those answers yet. So I'm really looking forward to exploring this more. The report, the chairman's report, goes on to say that the single most important action that we have to take urgently is to advance the national strength and survivability is to establish this executive agent, a cabinet secretary designated by the president with the authority, accountability, and resources to manage U.S. national infrastructure protection and defense against EMP and the other existential threats described above. And recall that this report was released in 2017, and President Trump's executive order was signed in 2019. So I think I'm making an assumption here that this report had an influence on President Trump, and it was probably the inspiration behind his executive order, which does exactly what this report says is the single most important action to take urgently, and that is to establish the executive agent who has the authority, the resources, the accountability to manage this problem and address it. Additionally, the chairman goes on to say, I encourage the president to work with congressional leaders to stand up a joint presidential congressional commission with its members charged with supporting the nation's leadership and providing expertise, experience, and oversight to achieve on an accelerated basis the protection of critical national infrastructures. Goes on to talk about what that is. The Presidential Congressional Commission on Critical Infrastructure Protection could engage the free world's preeminent experts on EMP and combined arms cyber warfare to serve the entire government in a manner akin to the Atomic Energy Commission of the 1947 to 1974 period. The United States should not remain in our current state of fatal vulnerability to a well-known natural and man-made threat. So this report was almost 10 years ago, and I'm very interested to see if we are still in what was then the current state of fatal vulnerability to a well-known natural and man-made threat. The chairman in the report goes on to outline its recommended actions, immediate actions, midterm, and long-term actions. The immediate actions that the commission recommended was that the president declare that an EMP or cyber attack constitute the use of weapons of mass destruction, retaliatory responses by the United States using all possible means, including nuclear weapons. Now, that's an interesting statement. Any such threat, this commission says, would justify preemptive or retaliatory responses by the United States using all means possible, including nuclear weapons. And if you recall, one of the nation states that was already mentioned in this report as having this capability, and not only having the capability or developing the capability, but has also expressed an intent to use it, was Iran. And of course, when I first read this report, we were not at war with Iran. We are now. Maybe not technically because Congress hasn't declared war. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago as well, how we can get into these conflicts without Congress actually weighing in. But, and I don't know if this type of an attack was part of the calculus on why we preemptively struck Iran when and how we did. But according to this report, it's certainly a possibility. A Defense Science Board study called Resilient Military Systems and the Advanced Cyber Threat from January 2013 equates an all-out cyber attack on the United States with the consequences of a nuclear attack and concludes that a nuclear response is justified to deter or retaliate for cyber warfare that threatens the life of the nation. While the manifestations of a nuclear and cyber attack are very different, in the end, the existential impact to the United States is the same. And so, I mean, that's incredible that this commission is saying that in order to prevent this type of an event, this catastrophic event that would happen in the aftermath of an EMP, to prevent it or to retaliate for it, use of a nuclear weapon on our part would be justified. So that is telling on how serious they believe this threat to be and how life-threatening, not just to the people, but to the nation, to warrant the use of nuclear weapons to prevent it. That's incredible.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And the book, just the 1 second after book, it illustrates why. And I think if we hadn't started with that premise of the book, people would think that's a very extreme
Strong
preemptive
statement.
measure, and it is. Yeah, it is an extreme preemptive measure because the effects of a widespread EMP attack are, like this report is saying, equivalent to, and in some cases worse than, a nuclear attack. And again, an EMP can be delivered via a nuclear weapon in the atmosphere, but it could be even worse than an actual nuclear missile hitting the ground and exploding on the ground, which would be obviously devastating. But an EMP in the atmosphere could potentially wipe out a wider area with that same nuclear weapon and impact many more people.
Yeah. I mean, when you're faced with the alternatives of either using a nuclear weapon preemptively or suffering an event that will kill 90% of your population, you can kind of see the math behind it, the reasoning. The commission says that I recommend that the president direct the Secretary of Defense to include a limited nuclear option for EMP attack among the U.S. nuclear strike plans and immediately assure targeting and fusing capabilities for some of the nuclear forces to implement a nuclear EMP attack capability. So again, is that what we did in Iran? Was it part of what we did recently in Iran? Maybe. I don't know. Interestingly enough, right after that statement in the report is a redacted sentence or two. No idea what that says, but I'm very curious. Whatever those redacted sentences are, it apparently refers to some satellite, because the very next unredacted sentence is if either or both of these satellites are nuclear armed, they should be intercepted and destroyed over a broad ocean area where an EMP resulting from possible salvage fusing will do the least damage. So apparently there's already a couple of satellites of concern that are in a position that if they were armed with a nuclear weapon, could pull this off. That's what this portion of the report is referring to. And the chairman says, I recommend that the president direct the Secretary of Defense to post ships in the Gulf of Mexico and near the east and west coasts and direct them to be prepared to intercept missiles from freighters. That was the case in the 1 second after book. Those weapons were launched from ships. I believe, in the Gulf of Mexico. Anyway, these ships should be posted and be prepared to intercept missiles from freighters, submarines, or other platforms that might launch a nuclear EMP attack on the United States. Ground-based U.S. national missile defense is primarily located in Alaska and California and oriented for a missile attack coming at the U.S. from the north, and are not deployed to intercept a missile attack launched near the U.S. coasts or from the south. Goes on to recommend to harden the FirstNet emergency communication systems against an EMP. The midterm recommendations from the Commission starts with recommending that the President direct the Secretary of Defense to deploy shore missile interceptors along the Gulf of Mexico coast to fill the gap in U.S. missile defenses. And then the rest of that paragraph is redacted. They recommend that the President direct the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to launch a crash program to harden the active nuclear power reactors and all spent fuel storage facilities against a nuclear EMP attack. We're obviously very reliant on nuclear power in this country as well, which would be rendered useless in the aftermath of an EMP. And not only useless, but dangerous, right? I don't pretend to understand how nuclear reactors work, but I do know that if things go off the rails and they're not very, very carefully managed with a super small margin of error, if those things start to melt down, now on top of not having power, you've got other problems as well. The Commission says they recommend They recommend to the President that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission launch this crash program to harden the active nuclear power reactors and all spent fuel storage facilities. And they typically only have enough emergency power. These nuclear power plants typically only have enough emergency power to cool reactors and spent fuel facilities for several days, after which they would go Fukushima, spreading radioactivity over the adjacent areas. So as soon as their emergency power source is depleted, they can no longer cool the reactor. The reactor melts down, Fukushima style, and now you have radioactivity spread over large adjacent areas, in addition to all of the other things that we were already talking about in the aftermath of an EMP and no power. Then their long-term recommendations. The Commission recommends that the President, through his executive agent, protect elements of the national electric grid, keystone critical infrastructure upon which all other critical infrastructure depends. Such elements can be protected from EMP at a very low cost relative to the cost of an EMP catastrophe, and I'm interested in what that low cost actually is, and paid for without federal dollars by a slight increase in electric rates. That's an interesting proposal, and I would love to see the math on that. Either way, like I said before, whatever the cost is, it's cheaper than going into a potential EMP catastrophe unprepared. The chairman says, I recommend that a similar approach be taken to key elements of the national telecommunications infrastructure and other national critical infrastructures. There's an aside here that points out progress made by the Department of Defense that says for more than a decade, the DoD has been derelict in its duties to lead the country in providing for national defense and security from EMP attack. This dereliction of duties should not be allowed by the leadership of the administration and Congress to continue. So, a very direct accusation leveled at the Department of Defense itself by the Commission here. Derelict in their duty, that's a pretty serious charge, especially in the military. Dereliction of duty is a serious thing.
Yeah.
So that's the immediate, midterm, and long-term recommendations from this Commission. What do you think, Jim?
Yeah, so I'm going to read really quick, because this report was in 2017, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
Yep.
And I'll read the EMP Commission history here in a second, which is the following part of the report. Before I get there, I just want to talk about just some research here on open source news reports of potential enemy, or adversaries, China, People's Republic of China, North Korea, Russia, Iran, probing our critical infrastructure in the United States just in the last 5 years. So here we are in 2026. So several years after this report, here's what's been happening. Open source news reports, several well-documented news stories and official advisories over the past 5 years have highlighted state-sponsored cyber activity, primarily attributed to Russia and China, probing or pre-positioning within U.S. critical infrastructure sectors. These include energy, water, wastewater, communications, telecom, transportation, and others. The activity often involves stealthy reconnaissance, living off the land techniques, using legitimate system tools to avoid detection and long-term embedding rather than immediate disruption, with U.S. agencies assessing it as preparation for potential sabotage during geopolitical conflicts such as over Taiwan. So this is what I'm pointing out here is potentially short of an EMP attack. There's, as was mentioned, there's also the ability to disrupt our critical infrastructure through sabotage and through or just locating where specific critical infrastructure is in the United States, which allows for potential better targeting from an EMP, for example. So our adversaries are actively probing and have been actively probing our critical infrastructure. So this isn't just a theoretical threat. It's a threat that is being corroborated by actual events on the ground, again, reported openly in the news. So the report goes on, the EMP Commission history that led up to this 2017 report. EMP Commission history, the commission to assess the threat to the United States from electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, attack was first established by Congress in the fiscal year 2001, following 5 years of classified and unclassified hearings by Congress to ascertain if Russia, China, and rogue states or terrorists had plans and capabilities to make an EMP attack. The final impetus to establish the EMP Commission was provided in April 1999 during the bombing of former Yugoslavia by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, when a congressional delegation meeting in Vienna to discuss the Balkans crisis with senior members of the Russian Duma were threatened with a hypothetical nuclear EMP attack against the United States. And here we are 25 years later without much progress. Review of the EMP threat. The Commission shall assess the nature and magnitude of potential high-altitude EMP threats to the United States from all potentially hostile states or non-state actors that have or could acquire nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, enabling them to perform a high-altitude EMP attack against the United States within the next 15 years. As you pointed out, Iran was very close to obtaining nuclear weapons. They had the material to make 11 weapons, apparently, during these recent negotiations just prior to the recent attacks, U.S. and Israeli attacks on Iran. The Iranian negotiators said they had enough material to make 11 nuclear weapons. And we know they have ballistic missile capability, so those are the two things you need. 2, the vulnerability of United States military and especially civilian systems to an EMP attack, giving special attention to vulnerability of the civilian infrastructure as a matter of emergency preparedness. 3, the capability of the United States to repair and recover from damage inflicted on the U.S. military and civilian systems by an EMP attack. 4, the feasibility and cost of hardening select military and civilian systems against EMP attack. And the recommendation, the Commission shall recommend any steps it believes should be taken by the United States to better protect its military and civilian systems from EMP attack. And as you read, the Commission did a very pointed and good, thorough job in making such recommendations. The EMP Commission Executive Report summarized the problem as below. Several potential adversaries have or can acquire the ability to attack the United States with a high-altitude nuclear weapon-generated EMP a determined adversary can achieve an EMP attack capability without having a high level of sophistication. EMP is one of a small number of threats that can hold our society at risk of catastrophic consequences. Our vulnerability is increasing daily as our use of and dependence on electronics continues to grow. The impact of EMP is asymmetric in relation to potential protagonists who are not as dependent on modern electronics. I'll point out that our societies around the world are getting more and more dependent on AI, or artificial intelligence, which, of course, is 100% reliant on electronics. And our AI is slowly creeping into running our critical infrastructure. It's already been creeping into helping the U.S. military make tactical targeting decisions. So if our systems are relying on AI, never mind just basic electronics, it just compounds how impactful having an EMP attack and wiping that out would suddenly uh, have devastating effects. And the average citizen is also becoming more and more reliant on AI for more and more things. So mm, there's a concern, of course, that AI is going to and already is starting to replace a lot of jobs. So even if imagine if several sub industries are replaced by AI in the next, say, 5 years or so, and now you have a whole pool of people who don't even do a particular job anymore because AI has been doing it for several years, which means you don't have a college pipeline or a training pipeline to train people for that job anymore. And now that's wiped out, and now you have whole sectors of industries that don't even have human knowledge and how to do that role anymore.
Yeah.
So it's just as time goes on, the threat gets worse and worse and worse. The Congressional EMP Commission 2004 executive summary stated that the recovery of any one of the key national infrastructures is dependent on the recovery of others. It is possible for the functional outages to become mutually reinforcing until at some point the degradation of infrastructure could have irreversible effects on the country's ability to support its population. An example I just gave is an example of that. Certain types of relatively low-yield nuclear weapons can be employed to generate potentially catastrophic EMP effects over wide geographic areas, and designs for variants of such weapons may have been illicitly trafficked for a quarter century. Another key difference from the past is that the U.S. has developed more than most other nations as a modern society heavily dependent on electronics, telecommunications, energy, information networks, and a rich set of financial and transportation systems that leverage modern technology. Therefore, terrorists or state actors that possess relatively unsophisticated missiles armed with nuclear weapons may well calculate that instead of destroying a city or military base, they may obtain the greatest political military utility from one or a few such weapons by using them or threatening their use in an EMP attack. And I'll finish my reading here at the bottom of page 14. The Congressional EMP Commission 2008 report, Critical National Infrastructures, made over 100 recommendations to protect the civilian critical infrastructures from nuclear EMP attack and other hazards.
Yeah, there was something there at the top of page 14 that I thought was really interesting. The commission said that the current vulnerability of our critical infrastructure can both invite and reward attack if not corrected. So their position is that in our current situation, we're asking for it because because we're so vulnerable. It's such an easy target, low cost, high yield, that if an adversary were so inclined and they were aware of it, it wouldn't really even make sense not to do it.
Right.
And the commission says that correction is feasible and well within the nation's means and resources to accomplish. So the question that we'll ask over and over in the next 3 weeks is, if that is true, Why have we not fixed this? Why are we still vulnerable if it's within our power and we have the resources to fix this? It makes no sense we would leave ourselves exposed like this. If everything this commission says is true, I don't understand why we're still in the position that we're in. Page 15, second paragraph, maybe provides some insight into that. It says that congressional efforts to reauthorize the EMP Commission became more urgent because of misleading and inaccurate reports that are impeding implementation of the EMP Commission's recommendations and are making the nation more vulnerable. So it doesn't really say, well, it does. It goes on to say what these inaccurate reports were. So the NERC and the Edison Electric Institute in 2012 apparently published some flawed reports stating that impeded initiatives by several states to protect their grids from EMP. So there were some individual states who were trying to act unilaterally to protect themselves. Good on them. The Joint Atomic Energy Intelligence Committee in 2014 published a report on EMPs that was factually inaccurate, according to this commission, and deeply flawed analytically, and that has impeded implementation of the commission's recommendations. 2016, Electric Power Research Institute, which was funded by the electric power industry, interestingly enough, published an erroneous report that significantly underestimates the nuclear E3 EMP threat to electric grids. I don't know what the motivation of the power industry would be to do that unless they're concerned that their customers are going to panic. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe we can ask our guest next week why the power industry and utilities would want to impede these efforts. You would think it would be good for business. I mean, rebuilding and protecting the grid, it would be a huge job creator and a huge injection of money into that industry. So that's curious to me. And then in 2016, a report by the U.S. Government Accountability Office, that may be an oxymoron, actually, U.S. Government Accountability, concluded that the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Energy, in conjunction with industry, have established a coordinated approach to identifying and implementing a key risk management activity or activities to address EMP risks. Congressional hearings subsequently confirmed that little or nothing has been done to implement EMP Commission recommendations to protect the electrical grid. So weird. The GAO claimed that things were happening that apparently were not happening to protect us from this threat. Commission goes on to say that, moreover, since the commission terminated in 2008, growing geopolitical instability, increased risk of war in the Middle East, we're there, Asia, and Europe, increasing threats from global terrorism, and increased awareness of natural EMP threats from the sun, all have heightened congressional concerns about dangers to the electric grid from EMP and other threats. And then they go on to give a couple of real-world and relatively recent examples. North Korea in 2012 and in 2016 orbited 2 satellites in polar orbits that cross over the U.S. on trajectories consistent with practice or preparation for a surprise nuclear EMP attack. That may actually be a hint of what was redacted in those previous paragraphs where it talked about these 2 satellites, that if they were armed with nuclear devices, the recommendation to the president was to destroy those things immediately. On June 9th, 2014, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula sabotaged the Yemen electrical grid, inducing a temporary nationwide blackout of 19 cities and 24 million people. First time in history that a terror attack has blacked out an entire nation. On March 31st, 2015, Turkey experienced a temporary nationwide blackout allegedly from a cyber attack by Iran, later denied by the Turkish government. On December 23rd, 2015, Western Ukraine was blacked out temporarily by a cyber attack from Russia. One of these is the first time in history that a large-scale blackout has been induced by a cyber attack. In July 23rd of 2012, the Earth was narrowly missed by a large coronal mass ejection from the sun. This would be similar to the Carrington event that we referred to in 1859. So we narrowly missed that, a recurrence of that in 2012. NASA estimates the likelihood of a potentially catastrophic worldwide natural EMP event from the solar superstorm is 12% per decade. We referenced that earlier. So in response to those events and others, so apparently there's more. The commission didn't give us the full rundown, the exhaustive list. Congress reestablished the commission to assess the threat to the United States from electromagnetic pulse attack. In FY 2016, in the FY 16 National Defense Authorization Act, expanding the purpose of the commission and revitalizing it. So I'll stop there before we get into some of the details here from our near-peer adversaries, EMP attack, combined arms cyber warfare. What are your thoughts on those recent events?
I just had a memory of a very recent natural occurrence in Spain and Portugal. If you remember this a few months ago, there was a nationwide blackout. So it was in 2025 called the 2025 Iberian Peninsula Blackout, also called the April 28, 2025 Spain-Portugal Blackout, which began at 12:33 local time on Monday, April 28th, 2025. It remains the most severe power system incident in Europe in over 20 years and was the first known major blackout triggered supposedly by overvoltage. So what caused it? According to the comprehensive factual report released by an expert panel on October 3rd, 2025, with a final root cause report planned for early this year, the collapse stemmed from cascading over voltages, a surge in electrical voltage beyond safe limits. The key sequence and contributing factors, I want to get more into the impacts here. And they did look at cyber attacks, investigated whether that was a cause, and that was ruled out. So the impacts. The blackout affected the entire Iberian Peninsula, which is mainland Spain, Portugal, and parts of southwestern France, impacting roughly 60 million people. It lasted up to 10 to 18 hours in many areas before full restoration. Major disruptions included transportation, high-speed and regular trains halted, stranding 35,000 passengers. Imagine being on a train and the train stops for an indefinite amount of time and you're in the middle of nowhere with no way to get anywhere. Metros, subways evacuated in darkness, airports reduced to 20% capacity with widespread delays, cancellations lasting days, traffic lights out, causing chaos and accidents, electric buses, trams, and ferries stopped, 286 elevator entrapments in Madrid alone, requiring emergency rescues. So this is great because this actually happened, and this was not an EMP. This was just a blackout. But you can start hearing these examples that we can't even think of. I never thought of like elevator entrapments, things like that. Communications and services, mobile networks and internet traffic dropped to 17% of normal. Card payments and ATMs failed. The cash-only economies emerged, and by the way, modern societies are moving away from cash slowly but surely, more towards electronic means only. In fact, a lot of businesses only take electronic or credit cards. They don't take cash anymore. Healthcare and emergency. Hospitals ran on backup generators. Routine procedures halted. Emergency services strained. Businesses were paralyzed. Estimated direct losses were $1.6 billion in 18 hours. Casualties, at least 8 deaths directly linked to the outage, 7 in Spain, 1 in Portugal, including carbon monoxide poisoning from generators, a candle-related fire, and a ventilator failure when battery backup ran out, and dozens more injuries. So that just happened last year, less than a year ago, and they did have the ability to have backup power because of generators and things like that. And of course, with an EMP, it's very likely there would be no backup power, but you can see the catastrophic effects on the nation of Spain and Portugal in less than 18 hours. due to temporary power loss.
That's incredible. Fortunately, there hasn't been a widespread catastrophic EMP anywhere in the world that we're aware of. So when this commission was studying the impacts and what recovery, if it were even possible, what recovery would look like, when they were studying that, they didn't have an EMP event to study. So they studied events like that, and there's a long list of them. There's like a subcategory of this report called "Life Without Electricity" that the commission published, and it's a series of events like that you just described that they looked at over the past 10 or 15 years, looking at how quickly things come off the rails just because the power goes out over a large area. As you just pointed out, there was no malice that we're aware of that was involved in that incident. It was just a naturally occurring event. It wasn't somebody trying to cause havoc for Spain.
Right.
So it really doesn't matter if it's a bad actor or if it's a sunspot or if it's sabotage or whatever. The end result is the same. When the grid is down, things start to come apart. Well, we'll talk about some more instances like that here in a minute that the commission highlighted. But where our adversaries are concerned, some of them have been very outspoken and clear in their language about their views on EMPs and their intent to develop the capability and then to use it. Nuclear EMP attack is part of military doctrine, plans, and exercises for Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran for a revolutionary new way of warfare against military forces and civilian infrastructure by cyber, sabotage, and EMP. In Russia, China, and Iran, it's called sixth-generation warfare, non-contact warfare, electronic warfare, total information warfare, cyber warfare. These are some of the names that it goes by. Some U.S. analysts, the very small number paying attention, call it cybergeddon, or blackout war, or combined arms cyber warfare. The commission says that ignorance of military doctrines of potential adversaries and failure of U.S. strategic imagination, as noted in military writings of potentially hostile powers, is setting America up for an EMP Pearl Harbor. That's pretty kind of alarmist language, but I don't think they're wrong, sadly. And if you listen to that, it's ignorance of the doctrines of our adversaries as noted in their writings of potential hostile powers. So it's not like our adversaries are even being cryptic about this. They're saying it out loud. They're writing it in their manuals, which we read or could read. And in some cases we have. Russia, for example, Russian General Vladimir Slepchenko, in his military textbook, Non-Contact Wars, described the combined arms or the combined use of cyber viruses and hacking, physical attacks, non-nuclear EMP weapons, and ultimately nuclear EMP attack against electric grids and critical infrastructure as a new way of warfare that is the greatest revolution in military affairs in history. The new Blitzkrieg is literally and figuratively an electronic lightning war, so potentially decisive in its effects that an entire civilization would be overthrown in hours. According to General Slepchenko, EMP and the new RMA renders obsolete modern armies, navies, and air force. For the first time in history, small nations or even non-state actors can humble the most advanced nations on Earth. An article in Military Thought, the flagship journal of the Russian General Staff, says that weak points of the U.S. concept of network-centric warfare points to nuclear EMP attack as a means of defeating the United States. They wrote down. A 2015 article from Russia's A.A. Maximov Scientific Research Institute for Space Systems alludes to a low-yield nuclear-enhanced EMP as the most effective cyber weapon. So Russia hasn't really minced any words on this. China's military doctrine sounds almost identical in theme. According to the People's Liberation Army textbook, World War, the Third World War, Total Information Warfare, written by Shin, I can't pronounce his last name, Wei Guang. Allegedly, according to the People's Republic of China, the inventor of information warfare. In his book, Shin says that therefore China should focus on measures to counter computer viruses, nuclear electromagnetic pulse, and quickly achieve breakthroughs in those technologies. He says as soon as its computer networks come under attack and are destroyed, the country will slip into a state of paralysis and the lives of its people will grind to a halt. Therefore, China should focus on measures to counter computer viruses, nuclear electromagnetic. An article, Overview of Electromagnetic Pulse Weapons and Protection Techniques Against Them, from the People's Republic of China Air Force Engineering University, states that information superiority has already become central and crucial to achieving victory in warfare. If the communications equipment used for the transmission of battlefield information were attacked and damaged by an opponent's EMP weapon, then the one attacked would face the danger of disruption in battlefield information transmission. EMP severely restricts the tactical performance and battlefield survivability of informatized equipment. Goes on to say, that article, EMP weapons are a new type of weapon capable of causing mass destruction by instantly releasing high-intensity EMP. They can interfere, damage, and overheat electronics, resulting in logic circuit dysfunction, control malfunctions, or total failure. The unique destructive effect that EMP have on electronic equipment was unintentionally discovered by the United States in the 1960s during a nuclear test. In July 1962, the United States conducted a high-altitude nuclear explosion in the Pacific Ocean, and this unexpectedly overloaded the Honolulu power grid in Hawaii, 1,400 kilometers away, even overheating lightning protection devices on power lines. On a battlefield, this new type weapon will cause devastating damage to electronic systems, including computers, communications and control systems, and radars, resulting in immeasurable losses. And if you're interested in that incident that's referred to in the 1960s where the United States tested this, it's called the fishbowl. You can look that up. Pretty interesting. A January 2016 article entitled General Trend of the Worldwide Revolution in Military Affairs and the Forum of Future War by China's National Security Policy Committee sees electromagnetic pulse bombs among the new disruptive technologies that could change the rules of the game by disrupting U.S. military precision warfare capabilities centered on information technology and thereby sounding, quote, the horn of a new round of revolution in military affairs, unquote. Iran, which is high on everybody's list of interesting things at the moment. A recently translated, again, this is 2017, a recently translated military textbook, ironically titled Passive Defense by the Army of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The military manual notes the potentially decisive effects of nuclear EMP attack to defeat an adversary in more than 20 passages within this publication. Ambassador R. James Woolsey, former director of the Central Intelligence, writes, Death to America is more than merely an Iranian chant. Tehran's military is planning to be able to make a nuclear EMP attack. Representative Trent Franks quoted from an Iranian military textbook recently translated by the Defense Intelligence Agency's National Intelligence University. The official Iranian military textbook advocates a revolutionary new way of warfare that combines coordinated attacks by nuclear and non-nuclear EMP weapons, physical and cyber attacks against electric grids to black out and collapse entire nations. Iranian military doctrine makes no distinction between nuclear EMP weapons, non-nuclear radio frequency weapons, and cyber operations. It regards nuclear EMP attack as the ultimate cyber weapon. Former CIA Director Woolsey notes that because EMP destroys electronics directly, but people indirectly, it is regarded by some as a Sharia-compliant use of a nuclear weapon. Passive Defense and other Iranian military writings are well aware that nuclear EMP attack is the most efficient way of killing people through secondary effects over the long run. The rationale appears to be that people starve to death not because of EMP, but because they live in materialistic societies dependent upon modern technology, which, of course, Iran has had a lot to say about Western civilization in that regard in recent years. An Iranian political military journal, in an article entitled Electronics to Determine Fate of Future Wars, states that the key to defeating the United States is EMP attack, and that, quote, if the world's industrial countries fail to devise effective ways to defend themselves against dangerous electronic assaults, then they will disintegrate within a few years. Goes on to state that today, when you disable a country's military high command through disruption of communications, you will, in effect, disrupt all the affairs of that country. If the world's industrial countries fail to devise an effective way to defend themselves against dangerous electronic assaults, they will disintegrate within a few years. American soldiers would not be able to find food, nor would they be able to fire a single shot. So again, Iran has not been shy about its designs either. And ironically, while electric power lobbyists are resisting EMP protections of the U.S. grid in Washington, the Iranian Mehr News Agency reported that Iran is violating international sanctions and going full bore to protect itself from a nuclear EMP attack. So, very interesting.
And then I'll read the beginning of this part about terrorists and criminals because I want to. I did some research on some recent probing by terrorists in the U.S. This report, 2017, says that terrorists, criminals, and even disgruntled individuals have already made localized EMP attacks using radio frequency weapons in Europe and Asia. Probably sooner rather than later, the RFW threat, or radio frequency weapons, will come to America. RFWs typically are much less powerful than nuclear weapons and much more localized in their effects, usually having a range of 1 kilometer or less. An attack by RFWs is much less conspicuous and may even be misconstrued as an unusual accident arising from faulty components in systemic failure. Some documented examples of successful attacks using radio frequency weapons are described in the DoD Pocket Guide for Security Procedures and Protocols Mitigating Radio Frequency Threats. And then there was some physical attacks it talks about using old-fashioned AK-47s on the Metcalf transformer substation that serves San Jose, Silicon Valley. So fast forwarding to current times here, several well-documented news stories and official advisories over the past 5 years, as I mentioned earlier, have highlighted state-sponsored cyber activity, primarily attributed to China and Russia, probing or pre-positioning within the U.S. critical infrastructure sectors. So the Chinese state-sponsored activity, this operation called Volt Typhoon, was disclosed in 2023 and was active since at least 2021 and has been ongoing apparently through 2025 and into 2026. U.S. government agencies, CISA, FBI, NSA, and allies, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the UK, are the Five Eyes, publicly warned in May 2023 and February 2024 that People's Republic of China, or PRC-linked actors tracked as Volt Typhoon had compromised IT networks in multiple critical sectors, including communications, energy, transportation, and wastewater systems across the U.S. and Guam. The hackers used living off the land methods for stealthy, long-term access, up to 5 years undetected in some cases, pre-positioning for potential disruptive or destructive attacks on operational technology systems to impede U.S. military readiness or civilian safety in a crisis. Follow-up reports 5/2026 confirmed the group remained active and embedded in U.S. utilities. This was reported in NBC News and thehackernews.com. And then Salt Typhoon major revelations in 2024 through 2026, also active since 2021. Chinese state-linked hackers infiltrated major U.S. telecom providers such as AT&T, Verizon, and Lumen. We may remember this I remember this in the news last year. And internet infrastructure stealing call records, surveilling communications, etc. FBI and CISA confirmed this in late 2024-2025 joint statements and advisories. It extended globally and was tied to espionage, supporting broader PRC goals, such as the Taiwan contingency planning. Updates into March 2026 highlighted ongoing breaches at telecom giants despite sanctions. This fits the Typhoon family of operations alongside Volt. And then I won't go into all of it, but it talks about Russian state-sponsored or linked activity from 2021 to 2025, targeting edge devices and energy. And also talks about Iran and North Korea, some lower level examples. So this is the EMP threat, of course, is the biggest potential catastrophic impact. But these lower level threats show that even on smaller scales, and this report pointing out, and it's the first time I've read this in this report about the directed energy weapons or the radio frequency weapons. You can take these low level attacks with people embedded in the U.S. near our critical infrastructure, and they don't even have to necessarily penetrate or get through a gate or get through security. They can still impact critical infrastructure using standoff radio frequency weapons and such things like that.
You can put it in the back of a pickup truck.
Yep. We remember, I think it was last year, there was in California, Camp Pendleton, if I'm not mistaken, there was, I think it was Al Qaeda linked terrorists or somebody that got through the gate to kind of probe our defenses. Anyway, the point being, our adversaries are actively probing our critical infrastructure. And that ties into and it kind of complements the intelligence gathering that they're trying to do, so that if and when any level of EMP type attack or electronic attack, they can make it smaller scale to target specific areas or regions of the country, or of course they can detonate a nuclear weapon in our atmosphere. However, that is harder to do. I mean, it takes a lot of technology and nation-state technology and will to successfully launch a nuclear ballistic missile into our atmosphere. That's significantly more challenging, but the point being, it can be done at much lower levels of attack using different means.
Yeah, the threat you just described is very real and probably more likely than a high altitude EMP. But again, the proximate cause that causes the meltdown of the grid is almost irrelevant. The mechanism by which it occurs is again almost irrelevant, because it's not the event itself that causes the damage. It's the aftermath, the time without electricity, that is the real killer, so to speak. And we haven't even talked about the insider threat yet. So
Right.
We talked about, saboteurs being in the country and taking these direct actions that you were talking about. But there's also an insider threat as well, that there easily could be people physically embedded and employed by these industries and these utilities that under whatever circumstances, when they're given the word, could wreak havoc from the inside out, in addition to all of the external actions that are taking place. And that's why immigration is a big concern for a lot of people. And I've heard it even more in recent days since the outset of hostilities with Iran. You've probably heard this reported as well, that estimates from the Department of Homeland Security is that there are somewhere in the neighborhood of 18,000 terrorist operatives that are in the country right now. And I guess just waiting for activation. In an instance like what we're talking about, it could be instigated by those people, or they could have instructions on what to do in the aftermath to make an already challenging situation even more untenable and unsurvivable. So there's no good scenario on how all this goes down. And other examples that go back a little bit further than the ones you just said, physical attacks on our power grid. We already mentioned this one on the Metcalf transformer substation in 2013. Also, and these are all in relatively rapid succession. In October of 2013, the Knights Templar, a terrorist drug cartel, used explosives and small arms to black out. It put 420,000 people into the dark, isolated them from federal police. And they did this so that they could publicly assassinate town and village leaders opposed to the drug trade. In June of 2014, Al-Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, used rocket-propelled grenade launchers to attack power lines, towers, blacking out all of Yemen, a nation of 16 cities and 24 million people. First time in history that terrorists have blacked out an entire nation. And they did it with RPGs. Not hard to come by, not expensive, and not difficult to operate. In January 2015, the Taliban blacked out most of the electric grid in Pakistan. So all of these blackouts were temporary, caused by sabotage of power lines or small substations. A coordinated attack on a relatively small number of the most important transformer substations could cause a protracted blackout lasting months. And as you read the rundown from 1 second after, just within 3 to 6 months, the effects of no electricity for that amount of time are devastating, especially to people who rely on insulin, as we saw. The Wall Street Journal has reported that a study by the U.S. FERC concluded that a terrorist attack that destroys just 9 key transformer substations could cause a protracted nationwide blackout. I don't know how many transformers we have, but whatever these 9 key transformers are, whatever their locations are, I hope they're well protected. Cyber attacks. There's a whole section in this report on cyber attacks that, for sake of time, we won't go into. Again, highly recommend people get a copy of this report for themselves. We'll put a link to it in the episode description here, and hope folks will take the time to read it. Misinformation. So the question that we've asked a couple of times is why, if we know about this threat, and it's not easy to mitigate, but it's possible, we have the resources and the capability, why haven't we done it? We mentioned briefly the misinformation about EMP. There's a section in the report here specifically about misinformation about EMP and the North Korean threat. The report says that one EMP skeptic correctly implies in his article that it is analytically risky to draw conclusions about the EMP threat when so much of the data is classified. It's riskier still for analysts with no technical training on EMP and without working professionally in the defense or intelligence communities of the EMP threat to conclude that the EMP threat is not real. That's the Commission's position, dismissing the consensus view of EMP experts who have advanced degrees in physics and electrical engineering, who have worked on EMP generation and effects for several decades, have throughout that time had access to the classified data and have conducted simulated EMP tests on a wide variety of electromagnetic systems beginning in 1963. In 2004, the Commission says 2 Russian generals, both EMP experts, warned the EMP Commission that the design for Russia's super EMP warhead was, quote unquote, accidentally transferred to North Korea, and that due to a quote unquote brain drain, Russian scientists were in North Korea helping with their missile and nuclear weapons programs. South Korean military intelligence told their press that Russian scientists are in North Korea helping develop an EMP nuclear weapon. In 2013, a People's Republic of China military commentator stated that North Korea has super EMP nuclear weapons. That's disturbing. The report goes on to say that the design of a super EMP weapon could be relatively small and lightweight. Such a device could fit inside North Korea's satellite that can orbit over the United States. If you're keeping track, this is now the 3rd or 4th time in this report that it specifically mentioned North Korea and satellites, and almost every time it's followed by a redacted portion of the report, which is also true in this instance that I just read about. So North Korea and its satellites seem to be a recurring theme in this report. One popular myth, the report says, is that during the 1962 Starfish Prime high-altitude nuclear test, just one string of nuclear lights failed in Honolulu, and that the test proves EMP is no threat. In 1983, a 12-page report, formerly classified confidential restricted data, summarizing the observed EMP effects of the Fishbowl U.S. exo-atmospheric test, that's the one from the 60s, has recently been reviewed at the request of the EMP Commission and found to be unclassified, but has been placed under a distribution restriction by the Department of Defense that makes it unavailable to analysts and others concerned about the viability of the U.S. critical national infrastructure. No justification for the distribution restriction has been given. So in other words, there's a report that's been unclassified, but you still can't get a copy of it, apparently. I find that very curious. We aren't the only ones who have tested this technology. In 1961 and 1962, Russia conducted a series of high-altitude EMP tests over Kazakhstan, an industrialized area nearly as large as Western Europe, and that test damaged the electric grid. Modern electronics are much more vulnerable to EMP than the electronics of 1962, exposed to Starfish Prime. A similar EMP event over the U.S. today would be an existential threat to our society due to our dependence on the electric power grid and other lifeline infrastructures, all the more susceptible due to the vulnerability of advanced electronic controls and communication. There's more discussion here about the effect of an EMP on vehicles. Apparently, at one point, at least 2% of vehicles would be at risk of EMP damage. I'm sure that percentage is much, much higher now, given the advances in technology used in vehicles. And shoot, some of our vehicles are full-blown electronic cars now, so I'm sure they would not fare well in an EMP. Unless, of course, Elon Musk has figured out a way to harden them against EMP threat. The report says over 50 years of EMP testing indicates that full field damage to vehicles would probably be much higher than was observed in the limited test. Today's vehicles depend on a much larger complement of electronics than the vehicles tested by the Commission more than a decade ago. Furthermore, vehicles cannot run without fuel, which cannot be pumped in a protracted electrical blackout. So even if there's gas at the gas station, you still couldn't get it into your car because the pump relies on electricity. The EMP Commission 2004 report warned against the U.S. military's increasing use of commercial off-the-shelf technology that is not protected against EMP. Our increasing dependence, this is a quote from the Commission, our increasing dependence on advanced electronic systems results in the potential for an increased EMP vulnerability of our technologically advanced forces, and if unaddressed, makes EMP employment by an adversary an attractive, asymmetric option. Reiterating what I said before, we're asking for it if we leave ourselves exposed. It's like a boxer that drops his guard. You're just asking to get clocked in the face.
All right, so I'm going to go on to page 37 of the report, The Fragility of Complex Systems. It says, when assessing the potential vulnerability of U.S. military forces and civilian critical infrastructures to EMP, it's necessary to be mindful of the complex interdependencies of these highly networked systems, such as that EMP upset and damage a very small fraction of the total system can cause total system failure. Which, again, to tie back to what we're saying about the targeted attacks by infiltrators on the ground, could take out just a small number of systems that could have a catastrophic effect. But this is talking about an EMP. So real-world failures of electric grids from various causes indicate that a nuclear EMP attack would have catastrophic consequences. I already read the summary of what happened in Spain and Portugal last year. It illustrates that. Significant and highly destructive blackouts have been caused by single-point failures cascading into system-wide failures, originating from damage comprising far less than 1% of the total system. For example, the Great Northeast Blackout of 2003 that put 50 million people in the dark for a day contributed to at least 11 deaths and cost an estimated $6 billion, originated from a single failure point when a power line contacted a tree branch, damaging less than 0.00001% of the system led to that much destruction. The New York City blackout of 1977 was caused by a lightning strike on a substation that tripped 2 circuit breakers, and it led to the arrest of 4,500 looters and the injury of 550 police officers. The Great Northeast Blackout of 1965 affected 30 million people, and it happened because a protective relay on a transmission line was improperly set. India's nationwide blackout in July of 2012, over 2 days, the largest blackout in history, affecting 670 million people, or 9% of the world population, was caused by an overload of a single high-voltage power line. Man. India's blackout in January 2nd, 2001, affected 226 million people, was caused by an equipment failure at the Uttar Pradesh substation. Indonesia's blackout in August of 2005 affected 100 million people, caused by overload of a high-voltage power line. Brazil's blackout in March of 1999 affected 97 million people, caused by a lightning strike on a transformer substation. And Italy's blackout in September 2003 affected 55 million people, caused by overload of 2 high-voltage power lines. And of course, San Francisco's blackout of April 2017 was caused by a failure of a single high-voltage breaker at a substation. It's mind-boggling to just list these off one after the other, because when they happen, they're kind of in the news for a couple of days, and then we forget about them. When you look at this sequence of several of these situations happening in different countries around the world, it's pretty stark at how vulnerable we all are to any type of electric transformer failure of any kind. In contrast to the above blackouts caused by single point or small scale failures, a nuclear EMP attack would inflict massive widespread damage to the electric grid, causing a large number of failure points. With few exceptions, the U.S. national electric grid is unhardened and untested against nuclear EMP attack. And again, this is about 10 years old. Hopefully by now, we're starting to harden some of our critical points, but we'll see. In the event of an nuclear EMP attack on the United States, a widespread protracted blackout is inevitable. The common sense assessment is also supported by the nation's best supercomputer modeling, which did some tests by the U.S. FERC or FERC, did a test and overwhelmingly confirmed it. So I'll turn it back over to you for the next section.
Yeah, that report by the FERC that assessed the terrorist attacks that destroyed just 9 transformer substations could produce that catastrophic damage that we've been talking about. And substations you can't go to Home Depot and buy a new substation. Those things take time to manufacture, and as I understand it, we'll talk about this more with our expert guest next week. But as I understand it, those things are not even manufactured in the United States. I hope I'm wrong on that. But so if these things went down, if 9 of these things went down and plunged us into that situation outlined in the book 1 Second After, we likely don't even have the organic capability to resolve that. The thing that's necessary, the replacement parts, are not even manufactured in this country. So it's an extremely vulnerable position to be in. And as you said, this report is about 10 years old. So I really hope that we've made strides in the right direction. And I'm very interested to talk to our friend from Capitol Hill on what he has seen in terms of action. For sake of time, we'll just go right to the conclusion of this report, because there's one other thing we want to talk about today. The conclusion at the end of this report: the United States critical national infrastructure faces a present and continuing existential threat from combined arms warfare, including cyber and man-made EMP attack, and natural EMP from a solar superstorm. With the development of small nuclear arsenals and long-range missiles by small, hostile, potentially unstable, and irrational countries, including North Korea, the threat of a nuclear EMP attack against the U.S. becomes one of the few ways that such a country could inflict devastating damage to the U.S. Therefore, it is urgent that the U.S. national leadership address the EMP threat as a critical, existential issue and give a high priority to assuring that necessary leadership is engaged and the necessary steps are taken to protect the country from EMP. Otherwise, foreign adversaries may reasonably consider such an attack as one which can gravely damage the U.S. by striking at its technological Achilles heel without having to overcome the U.S. military, which has proven very formidable in recent months. Protecting and defending the national electric grid and other critical infrastructures from EMP attack could be accomplished at reasonable cost and minimal disruption to the present systems that comprise our critical infrastructure, all commensurate with the Trump administration's plans to repair and improve U.S. infrastructures, increase their reliability, and strengthen our homeland defense and military capability. Continued failure to address our country's vulnerability to high-altitude nuclear weapon-generated EMP invites attack.
Something you
That
said.
concludes the report. What's that?
Something you said. You mentioned that our military prowess has been proven quite formidable last several months. Of course, with the conflict in Iran so far has been an overwhelming, I don't want to use the word success yet because it's still ongoing, but our overwhelming military dominance is on stark display. Preceding that was the incredible infiltration of Venezuela to capture Maduro and his wife with 0 U.S. casualties. Just incredible operation using cyber and space and naval forces and ground forces. Just incredible. And before that was the B-2 strike on the nuclear sites in Iran that were unbelievably precise and flawless. What this does is it advertises a negative effect of this, that it advertises to our adversaries, potential adversaries, what our capabilities and strengths are. And they work on coming up with asymmetric ways to avoid our strengths, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And
That's
we
Sun
know
Tzu.
this. Yeah, exactly. Sun Tzu. So after in the 1991 Gulf War, which is another overwhelming U.S. military success, China and Russia, but especially China, openly were in awe of how effective that operation was. And ever since then, both worked to find asymmetric ways to, again, to undermine or overcome the strengths that the U.S. displayed. One thing not mentioned in this report, I'm kind of surprised, frankly, is hypersonic weapons. And you can arm nuclear.
Yep.
Hypersonic weapons with nuclear capability, and the hypersonic weapon development was one of the ways that China and Russia, one of the technologies they invested in heavily and tested heavily during our long, 20-year protracted war on terror, because we were focused heavily on in Afghanistan and Iraq, and went away from focusing on conventional military type of weapon technology. So China and Russia invested heavily in that, and before September 11, 2001, the U.S. was far ahead in hypersonic missile technology, and then we kind of put it on pause just because we're focused on in the Middle East and in the war on terror, and China and Russia got ahead of us. So anyway, this is just an example of how our adversaries see where our strengths are, and they try to find ways to asymmetrically undermine our strengths, and this is one of the ways that they definitely can do that.
Yeah, right on the money. Right on the money. Low cost, not extremely difficult to pull off, doesn't require a lot of training, uh, which is what makes this sort of thing extremely dangerous. Sean Ryan recently had a guest on his show that was talking about asymmetric warfare. Young kid, super smart dude who is involved in a lot of very interesting things in this realm. And he brought up, you know, some of the very simple technologies, things that in his words are stupid easy to make and build and employ on a mass scale. We're not talking about a single event or even two or three, but dozens, scores, hundreds that can be done at the same time. And if we are not actively preparing for that sort of thing, not just to prevent it, but to deal with the aftermath if we fail, if our prevention efforts fail, then we're setting ourselves up for a very, very difficult time. So all of this again started, back in 2004 when the original commission's report was published. And then there have been a couple of iterations since then. The one that we just went through was from 2017 when Congress reinstituted that EMP commission. And the language changes a little bit. The threat now, so in just the space between those two reports, 13 years or so, the language has changed, and now the threat is described by the commission as being existential. We just went through the long list of both natural and hostile events that could realistically and feasibly take place in our lifetimes. This existential threat from China, Russia, North Korea, Iran that are named explicitly, the EMP is no longer a theoretical threat. It's integrated into modern warfare doctrine, literally. I mean, it's in writing in their manuals. And there's a detail. It was only mentioned once, I think, in the report. But it stood out to me for reasons that we'll explain here. One of the delivery mechanisms for this type of nuclear EMP, one of the delivery mechanisms that the report specifically mentioned, I believe it only mentioned it once, was high altitude balloons. You don't really think of balloons as being modern military weapon. But even this guy that Sean Ryan interviewed, he mentioned balloons as viable delivery methods.
So the stratosphere I can talk less about.
Okay.
I think it's the most important. And this is the bet we're placing as a company that is sort of most distinct and also kind of most controversial right now. I am a huge believer, and you're going to laugh, I'm a huge believer and have been since high school, that balloons are the most important tools in future conflict.
You mentioned that at breakfast.
I did. Well, the balloon in the U.S. this week, the Chinese balloon,
the
people
Mexican
started
cartel
taking
drone that wound up being a happy birthday balloon.
Exactly. I mean, the Russians are starting to send balloons out at Lithuania. It's causing a real problem. Obviously, I got a ton of traction. So the Chinese balloon happened during that semester after I had dropped out, which was part of why we were able to get funding, is I was talking to all these people talking about balloons, and they're like laughing. And then suddenly our entire country freaks out because of balloons. But yeah, I won't go into it too specifically, but shooting a balloon down is so much harder than putting a balloon up. So much harder. And there are... So putting a balloon up is super easy for obvious reasons, right? Like you fill it up with gas and it goes up to, let's say, 60,000, 80,000 feet. Well, to then go pop it, you've got to send a missile or a plane up to 60 to 80,000 feet. And so we talk a lot about asymmetry. Like, this is asymmetry at the maximum.
I see what you're saying.
And then the interesting thing is there's these companies, Loon is the most famous, that actually developed ways of navigating balloons. So instead of this being something that's like a party balloon that goes up, pops, disappears, basically forms a satellite that can navigate, that can station keep, that can do all these different things. And so suddenly you've got a payload at an altitude that's 100 to 1,000 times more expensive to shoot down than it is to put up, They can actually tack against wind patterns and lock in places. And then from there, there's obviously really interesting things you can do once you have a payload up at that altitude. And then the more interesting thing is if I can have thousands of payloads, like hundreds of thousands of payloads up at that altitude at a given time. So we have Stratus payloads up at altitude, really, really interesting things you can do deploying those things at scale. And something I should mention is, like, as we talk logistics, the logistics of balloons are pretty fantastic because you can launch them thousands of miles away. And so you and I could launch a balloon here and have it up over X country, actually much quicker than I think most people realize. And so the logistics problem gets significantly easier.
And so how did you come to the conclusion that balloons would be so important?
It's just physics. You look at how cheap something is to put up, you look at how expensive it is to shoot down. You think about inventing new ways to shoot stuff down. Like, you start wargaming. Well, if you're shooting down balloons, well, what if the balloons are carrying air-to-air missiles, all these different things. So anyway, we've held that contention strongly for a while as a company. We're working very, very, very
does this stuff just pop in your head? Or, I mean,
it does. I mean, a lot of this, I can't claim all of these ideas. Like, and it's always hard to tell where an idea comes from, but you're talking to hundreds of different people in a given day. Like, I didn't invent Loon. Right? Like, I read the Loon library in high school. They published all of it. They published how to go and navigate these balloons. And so you go and read that, and suddenly you start thinking about these things and can extrapolate pretty quickly.
But the reason this caught my attention was because, if you recall, back in January of 2023, there was a Chinese high-altitude spy balloon that crossed the United States.
In February, a suspected Chinese spy balloon flew over the United States before being shot down by an F-22 U.S. warplane off the coast of South Carolina. The U.S. Navy recovered the debris from a 200-foot tall vessel to examine its capabilities and the potential intelligence it gathered along its journey at 65,000 feet. So what kind of information could this spy balloon have collected? Let's start by looking at the path it took.
Well, we know that it entered the United States at the Aleutian Islands, and then it flew over parts of Alaska, re-entered the United States at Idaho, but went over Montana, where Malmstrom Air Force Base is, and other sites that have nuclear missile silos. We can surmise from other sightings of it over Kansas that it probably went over Nebraska as well, where Strategic Air Command is. So it probably went over nuclear missile sites as well as command and control. These sites are sensitive for a reason, right? I mean, they're the most strategic assets that the military has. They have nuclear weapons that could destroy the world. So they need to have the utmost security. And if you have a foreign adversary looking at them, presumably they're picking up some information from that. They would certainly have had high-resolution cameras on it to take still photos, but they probably had full-motion video as well. They may have also had devices that would have picked up on communications. The balloon itself was 200 feet tall, and the payload that carried the surveillance gear was the size of a regional jet airliner, and it weighed thousands of pounds. So if you're dropping that, shooting it down, and it drops from 60,000 feet, it's going to hit something. And the other factor was that we spied on the spy. We picked up on its capabilities because it was over the United States, and we were able to monitor it and see what it was doing. So we learned just as much as the Chinese in examining what was going on with their balloon.
There were a lot of things about it that caught my attention because I had read this book 1 second after. And if you recall, do you recall from the book? In the book, there were 3 EMPs that were detonated over the United States. The one centrally located over the continental U.S. was detonated over the Midwest in the Kansas and Nebraska region. And I had seen the original report that was presented to the House of Representatives back, I believe, in 1997, that map of where the most likely and most devastating locations for EMP detonation would be over the United States. And this is what that map looked like. All right, so this is a map of the threat down here at the bottom of the screen. The threat posed by electromagnetic pulse (EMP) to the U.S. military systems and civil infrastructure. Testimony before the House of Representatives Committee of National Security, July 16, 1997. So you see that path from northwest to southeast of the U.S., tracking over the Midwest, with that central location, right there near Nebraska and Kansas. So this report said that a nuclear device detonated at an altitude of 30 miles above the Earth could generate an electromagnetic pulse strong enough to damage or destroy electronics within an area of 720,000 square miles. And at higher altitudes, the damage would affect even larger areas. So that was the hypothetical path, these locations that are the most devastating. Then in January 2023, Chinese spy balloon tracks over the continental U.S. That path looked familiar?
Yep.
The altitude of the balloon was only 55 or 60,000 feet, so only about half of what it would have needed to be in order to have, if there had been an EMP device on board, it wouldn't have been a nationwide blackout. But it was, the track caught my attention, the altitude caught my attention, and my first thought when I saw this balloon tracking across the U.S., my mind instantly went back to Fortune's book and this report, and I was a little bit nervous.
You had already read the book before that happened, right? Before that balloon incident?
I had. Real quick, so if you put these two things side by side, so on the left, you have the Chinese spy balloon's actual track across the country, and on the right, you have the original report from 1997 of what the most devastating track and locations would look like. Strikingly
interesting.
similar.
Yes. Very interesting.
So, again, we're not claiming that this Chinese spy balloon was an EMP platform, but its path, its altitude was certainly interesting. We are asking some legitimate questions, I think. Why a balloon? Why that particular altitude? Why that particular path? The Congressional Commission report explicitly warned about not only that very delivery mechanism, the balloon, but also that very path as well, which showed up in the 1997 report to the House of Representatives. The track that the balloon took it over central Midwest United States. Not only is that location interesting and important because of the strategic assets that we have in those locations, it's also important because of the fact that it has been identified as the key location for the detonation of an EMP to take out the center of the country's electric grid and infrastructure. Key locations where an EMP would have the most devastating effects. And then the trajectory of this balloon tracks almost exactly with that original map that we saw from 1997. Is that an accident? I have no idea. Fortunately, there wasn't an EMP device on this particular balloon, and its altitude was about half of what it would have needed to be in order to have maximum effect. But I do find its trajectory and its altitude and the possibility that it could have. And what would we have done if it did? Because now, if you're talking about shooting that balloon down, not only is it just the size and the weight of the thing that's now falling to the earth from 60,000 feet or more, blowing up a vehicle that also has an EMP device on board. Just by taking the device out, you're going to detonate it. So I was very disconcerted when that whole thing was going down, because it looked to me like almost exactly what I had read in William Forsyth's book, with the altitude being the one saving grace and exception. But even at 60,000 feet, it would have taken out a significant portion of the region. if an EMP had been detonated. So the EMP Commission's report, all of these studies that were done, and we'll get into some of the practical application side of it next week with our guest. These blackouts that have occurred that were studied by the commission, and how do utility companies deal with that? How do you bring them back online? How would that differ if everything in the entire country was down? A full restart, a full reboot from nothing. How do you even do that? So that'll be interesting. But all of that study and those recommendations from the commission, I think that was the impetus behind Executive Order 13865 that President Trump signed on March 26th of 2019. Jim, do you want to give us a rundown of what that order stated?
Sure. The purpose of Executive Order 13865 was that it was focused on EMPs from high altitude nuclear detonations or natural geomagnetic disturbances, or GMDs, have the potential to disrupt, degrade, or damage technology and critical infrastructure across large areas. It declares that enhancing national resilience to these effects is a priority. So the national policy laid out in that executive order says that the United States must prepare for EMP effects with coordinated whole of government actions, warn of impending EMPs, protect against their effects and enable response and recovery, prevent adversarial EMP attacks through deterrence, defense, and nuclear non-proliferation, encourage private sector engagement, and share threat vulnerability information. And that's a very Trumpian type of mentality, public-private partnership, him being a businessman before he was president. That's wise, I think. Prioritize research and development for EMP resilience. And the coordination that was directed in that executive order involved or included the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, will coordinate the federal response and implementation of the order, and the Director of the Office of Science and Technology will oversee R&D, or research and development coordination among agencies. And there'll be annual reports on progress, gaps, and recommendations. And then agency roles and responsibilities. The order directed the State Department to lead diplomatic engagement with allies on EMP resilience, strengthen nuclear non-proliferation to reduce adversarial EMP threat potential for the Department of Defense, now the War Department, improve capability to detect, analyze, forecast, and warn of EMP events, conduct R&D to develop technologies to understand and protect military systems, incorporate EMP scenarios into defense planning, and provide data to partners. In the Department of Commerce, he directed that they provide forecasting analysis of natural EMP events and improve commercial standards and forecasting services. Department of Energy, lead energy sector R&D on EMP effects, mitigation, and electric grid vulnerability. And then again, partner with private sector agencies for grid preparedness. Department of Homeland Security, distribute EMP threat information to government and critical infrastructure partners, coordinate risk assessments, response, recovery plans, and exercises. And the Director of National Intelligence, he directed that he produce intelligence on adversary EMP capabilities and likelihood of attacks, and support quadrennial EMP risk assessments. And then all sector-specific agencies enhance information sharing with the private sector to improve preparedness and vulnerability reduction.
So I'm particularly interested next week talking to our first guest on three of those those bullets that you just read. The first, I'm interested to see how this directive to encourage private sector engagement and to share threat and vulnerability information, how that's played out since this executive order was signed. Also, the directive to the Department of Energy to partner with the private sector and agencies for grid preparedness Super interested to find out if that's happening and how. And then third, this enhanced information sharing with private sector to improve preparedness and vulnerability reduction. So I'm curious to see if this marriage between the federal government and the private sector to start resolving this problem, how that marriage is working out.
Yeah. I'm also curious to see just how, with the Trump administration being split with the Biden administration, and knowing that when the Biden administration came in, there was an attempt or an effort to directly end all of Trump's first term executive orders. At least that was the public messaging. I wonder if this is one of them that was spared or not, or if
That's a
there
great
was
question.
a new executive order that was put in or what, because I can't imagine they would want to, and that because this is executive order is not political at all. It's an obvious threat. So I'm just curious. I guess we can research that in between now and next episode.
Yeah,
how the Biden
I wish we'd thought to
administration
ask that
continues.
question and look into it before this. You're right.
Yeah.
It wouldn't make any sense not to not keep this one in place, unless, of course, the executive fell prey to what Hamilton warned about, that some men resist even good ideas because it wasn't theirs.
Yeah, and that goes to the polarization of the country today. It was no matter, it happens on both sides. If one party comes up with it, the other party automatically hates it 90% of the time, without any analytical thought.
Yeah. So that was just a rundown of the commission's findings, of the history behind it, kind of explaining the threat and providing real world examples that were given by the commission. It's not science fiction. It's a very, very real existential threat that could spell the end and the end of the nation and the death of 90% of its inhabitants, according to their studies. And again, these folks aren't alarmists. They're professionals. They're physicists. They're people who know what they're talking about, and we should listen to them. So the question today is not, is an EMP real? Congress has already answered that question. The president has provided clear direction for tangible and measurable action. So the real question is, if the danger is known, why does our grid still look the way that it does? And in the next episode, we're going to ask an expert in the field that works inside the system, works with the electrical grid, what would actually happen if the lights went out for real? And why bringing them back isn't as simple as just flipping a switch. So you won't want to miss that. Next week, episode 2 of Lights Out, right here on Fire for Effect.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. And again, if you like this episode or any of our episodes, please share. What we've learned being relatively new podcasters is the algorithm doesn't help us on its own. We need you to help the algorithm help us, again, by sharing, liking, and commenting and asking questions, and we'll answer the questions to the best of our ability. So thanks again for joining us.
Jim, appreciate you, man. Thanks for being here today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Marcus. See you
God
next
bless
week.
you.